Thank you for inviting me to do one of these webinars again, to tell you about a little bit about Good Grief Guiseley. I'll recap a little bit about how Good Grief Guiseley started, a bit about my background and why I became interested in community grief, and what I've found has helped me in my past and recent loss and grief, acknowledging that this is just my story, one amongst millions of others that have happened, you know, sort of in the last couple of years. When we hear stories, we can glean more information, maybe discover more options, which can prepare us, and it can give us confidence. It can let us know that we're not alone, that we all have our own individual grief and story, and that others have trod this path before. My story won't be right for everybody. We're all individual with different circumstances and opportunities, but so many people, despite their best intentions, did not have this opportunity. But it is my story, and I hope that it is useful, and it definitely helped with my grief and that of my family and my extended family. I'll then talk a bit about how our community has tried to come together over the last year to support and acknowledge grief, and also the plans for the future. There'll be some photos as I'm talking that just give a snapshot of some of these ways. And I'm hoping technology works as well as last year. If not, we'll just muddle through. So many people felt isolated, not being able to share their grief with loved ones and friends, with many of the rituals around the death of a loved one that we took for granted before COVID being restricted. Yet there's been some wonderful, wonderful examples of the community reaching out and trying to connect despite restrictions, and also some wonderful examples of trying to find alternative ways to connect, acknowledge and continue our bond with loved ones who have died. Please ask any questions and I'll answer them if I'm able. Any suggestions about how we can take Good Grief Guiseley forward would be fantastic. Conversations are always good. So the first meeting of Good Grief Guiseley was in November 2019, just before the first National Grief Awareness Week. And I've always thought this was just staggering that with all the special days that we acknowledge, that this was the first time in 2019 that we actually acknowledged grief in a week. It's a community initiative led by local residents and organisations experienced in bereavement and community development, and it is supported by Leeds Bereavement Forum. I mentioned last year that there are so many groups of communities in our area catering for all ages. There's sports, there's arts, there's walking, there's gardening, there's friends of parks and cemeteries, there's church and uniform groups, in bloom groups, litter picking groups, so many groups, all within the bigger community of Guiseley, and many of these groups overlap with no hard defined edges at all. And we hope by opening up and normalising conversations about grief and loss, that people would feel supported enough, connected enough and confident enough that they could feel like these conversations could continue across the different groups. Grief doesn't belong to one group. It's an emotion that belongs to everybody. And we hope to build on the obvious care and compassion that is evident in our community already. But these conversations needed to be inclusive, without airy boundaries. Despite it being Good Grief Guiseley, we needed the Guiseley bit for people to feel that they belonged to them, but we didn't want these conversations to be just in Guiseley. We're part of a bigger conversation here, and it needed to be part of normal conversation. As a nation, we're not very good talking about death, dying and grief, and it's not because we don't care. Often we feel that we don't know what to do or what to say. We don't want to intrude, or we fear upsetting the person even more. But it is so nice when you do mention their name. We may still cry, we may still be upset, but we know that you haven't forgotten them. We haven't forgotten them. So the poster says, say the name, we're thinking about them anyway. So it's all about community, kindness, conversations, and spaces where we can feel supported to talk, and more importantly, where we can feel that we are heard. So many times we feel we are not heard, and that can stop us talking, and that can stop us making connections. Listening is definitely a superpower. Tea and cake were also very, very important. I did notice we had community interest company CIC in our introductions, and I thought I should mention we're not a CIC. We purposely didn't want to be bogged down with the working up of setting up a company. We don't have a bank account, and we rely on small funding grants to be used at community events. Any money is held and ring-fenced in other CICs. Guiseley Theatre and Codswallop have been fantastic in this, and we work really closely with them, and it seems to have worked so far. So big thanks to them. So why the interest in community grief? 5 years ago, my son, Ed, died suddenly and unexpectedly. He had just started university and was the youngest of our 3 children. And when he died, the Fern Foundation that supported our lives was just absolutely shattered. All that I'd been certain of was just uncertain. And I saw the effects of Ed's death on his sisters, on his grandparents, on friends, the brothers and sisters of friends, on cricket, on rugby. It just ricocheted across so many communities, young and old. And I realised that what I knew about grief was just so minuscule. It isn't just the physical presence of your loved one that you lose. It's the dreams and it's the plans for your future life together. It's not just the present. It's the future you have to learn to plan and live with, and it affects everything. There's no bit of life that is unaffected. And everybody seems to walk on eggshells, trying to put their life back together again, whilst all the time it seems around you that life just goes on as normal for everybody else. So some of the things that helped me after Ed died was that I went to counselling early on. It didn't fix my grief. It just allowed me to talk and express my grief with a neutral person outside of family and friends that didn't impact on their grief. And it allowed me to get back onto steady ground. Self-care and kindness is just so important. You've got to look after yourself. You've got to allow yourself that space. We all recognise that our grief was individual, and we all have our own ways of learning to live with grief. Never getting over it, but moving forward with it. There's no one face of grief. I accept now that there will always be an undercurrent of sadness in our lives. We are sad, we miss him, it's sad. It's heartbreaking, but we can also find joy and laughter. Being sad doesn't mean I can never smile. And just because I'm smiling, it doesn't mean I'm not grieving. So it was the importance of safe places in the community, to walk in nature, to look at the clouds and the stars, to do yoga and art, to use the other side of my brain that wasn't thinking, just to allow my brain to be still at times and to express my feelings without the needs for words. It was spaces to use my imagination, imagining where he had gone, thinking about time, thinking about the stars, how we all fit into this world. It was big thoughts. Having my grief acknowledged, it helped so much talking with friends for hours in cafes, on dog walks, and it was the importance of saying Ed's name in that conversation, then worrying that I was saying his name too much, for too long, that after a year I was expected to have got over it and moved on. It was reading so many books about connecting bonds, using my previous health visiting experience to acknowledge attachment, listening to podcasts such as Griefcast, which is absolutely fantastic, and listening to so many stories that eventually I realised that what I was feeling was normal. That although Ed had died, he wasn't going anywhere in our lives. He's such a big part of us in our lives that if we didn't talk about him in normal conversations, we'd be stuck with his death. We wouldn't be able to talk about the happy memories the funny times we had had. And this would stop us coming together to create so many more happy memories. So we take him with us as part of us. We're still a family of 5. We formed new routines, which included visiting the cemeteries where we had buried Ed's ashes. I know many of his friends visit also. It's a new community, growing all the time. We designed his headstones, his headstone, which took us over 4 years. We couldn't find the words to put on it, and it was important to include all the family. We took our time, and working with somebody who gave us that time, allowing us to create something that was so meaningful for us, was priceless, and it was so helpful. Other things that helped were friends, new and old, who could just be by your side, who understood grief and loss without the needs for words, recognising that you can't fix grief. There's nothing to fix. There's no magic remedy, but it really helps just to have people by your side. So these were just a few things that helped. The majority of them were from and in the community. It was time spent in places where I could express my thoughts and feelings. It was normal conversation with friends and with family, including Ed in that conversation. It was also acknowledging other people's grief. There's no hierarchy in grief. We're all individual and everybody is entitled to grieve and have their own grief. I mentioned last year that I was a nurse, now retired, and prior to health visiting, I had spent my first qualified years working on an oncology ward, where I had loved working with families, sharing the care and working with the team, supporting people during the good and the difficult times. I'd been by the side of many people when they had died, and I'd always considered this to be an absolute privilege. It was still an absolute privilege, but completely different when I cared for my mum early this year after she was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer. She died in August this year. And I would like to talk about what helped me, our friends and family with our recent grief, and especially what information we have that enabled us to feel a little more in control in a time when the NHS and care services were so overstretched, when contact was limited, and where there's so much uncertainty, fear and restrictions. We had just come out of Christmas lockdown and the vaccination programme had just about started. So I'll just say a little bit about my mum. She was a mentally and physically active 87-year-old. She lived independently a couple of hours from here. She had many friends who she kept in contact with by telephone. She had mastered house party and was a nervous Zoom user, but accepted she would have to get used to using it if she was to continue meeting and seeing her friends, especially their faces, and also giving her stamp presentations. And prior to COVID, she was still going out to work 1 day a week, transcribing handwritten records to go on the internet for others to do their family history. She had had her latest article for family history printed in January this year. She was always on the go. Her memory was better than mine. She was an active and included part of her community, loved gardening, and had lived in the same house for 59 years. She loved people. She was very organised, practical, realistic, and she was also very, very grateful. We were reassured that she was living her best possible life in the circumstances. My brother, who was in a bubble, visited weekly with shopping. I saw her less frequently because of shielding, but we were in regular contact. And in early January, just as we were coming out of lockdown, a neighbour rang to say she was worried about Mum. She seemed more frail. She had seen well at Christmas with my brother. I travelled to stay with her for a couple of days. I came home once in the next 7 months. Life can change in an instant, I knew this from when Ed had died. My mum became ill very quickly and needed someone to care for her in her home. She knew she was ill. I knew that Mum had written and updated her will years ago, and had also given power of attorney for health and finance to my brother and I. My brother had helped Mum with any financial dealings following my dad's death 4 years ago. We had not discussed in detail the power of attorney for health, which in retrospect we absolutely should have. My mum had always seemed so fit and healthy, and we thought we would have time. This was the time, and I was so thankful to be able to borrow and to use the words from Dr. Catherine Mannix and from other palliative care doctors to start the conversation. So over a cup of tea, sat at the table, we talked about the power of attorney for health. And I said, if I am to speak on your behalf and follow your wishes, I need to know what your wishes are. So with a few of the questions I asked were, if you are ill enough to die, in the ideal world, where would you like this to be? If you are ill enough to die, what would be the most important thing for you? If you are ill enough to die, is there anything you would like to listen to? What music? Who would you want to have by your side? If your heart stopped beating, would you want me to try and start it again? Would you want me to call an ambulance for them to start it? Would you want to go to hospital? What I thought was going to be a really difficult conversation was so positive. She said she was so glad to be asked. She'd been thinking about it. It was in the news, it was in the newspapers, it was everywhere you looked. She was keen to talk and she was keen to have it recorded. She was ready with the headed note paper. Very important. I downloaded 2 copies of the Living Will from the Compassion in Dying website. And I downloaded 2 copies so that we could read it and go through it page by page, sitting opposite each other over the following days, checking and rechecking any details and talking about wider health, using this as a prompt. She absolutely wanted to get it right. The Living Will is also known as the advanced decision, and it's a form which lets you refuse any medical treatment you do not want to be given in the future. There may be a time when you feel too unwell to say what your wishes are, and this supports your wishes. And it will only be used if you can't make that decision yourself. You can always overrule it. Following our conversations, I knew that if Mum's heart stopped beating, she didn't want me to start it again. What was most important to her was being able to see and be with her family. She wanted to die at home if possible, at a hospice if not. She did not want to die in hospital. She wanted to be able to see her garden and still be part of her community. She wanted to be as pain-free as possible. And the quality of her life was more important than living longer. There is space to put all this information in the form, either in freehand or online. It just needed to be countersigned by someone outside of the family to make it legal. Because of restrictions, there was limited choice as we weren't seeing anybody else outside of the family, except for one visit by her GP, who didn't seem to have much knowledge or interest about the Living Will. Took away the information that was offered to record in the medical respect form. We were promised a copy, and this came 4 months after Mum's diagnosis, after repeated requests. But having these conversations, despite the form not being witnessed, was so helpful. When Mum's consultant rang a couple of weeks later to tell of and discuss Mum's diagnosis of advanced pancreatic cancer, no treatment was available, and her options were to be admitted for care in hospital or to be cared for at home with support to control the symptoms of her illness. This message was done really well. It was given in a really supportive, thoughtful way. And we were already prepared for this possibility. We had already discussed it and agreed as a family that we would do our best to support Mum's wishes. Mum was staying at home. There'd be no change for her except that support was now available in the form of a special bed downstairs, which was essential. I don't know how I would have been able to move and care for my mum for months without this. Anticipatory drugs were prescribed to be kept at home to enable Mum to be as pain-free as possible during her illness. And we were also referred to the district nurses service. When Mum first met the district nurse, who was really supportive, as were the whole service of us all over the next few months, the only thing she asked of her was that if she could countersign her living will. It was so important to her to have it in her possession. It gave her some control and confidence that her wishes had been noted and listened to. It gave her peace of mind right until the end. And Mum became such a staunch advocate of the living will. She'd discuss it with anybody and everybody who came round, anybody who would listen on the phone. And the second copy downloaded was actually given to a visitor for her to fill in. And it opened up so many conversations with so many people, young and old, about death and dying. It was really important to us too, and it really helped when caring for Mum. We reviewed it a couple of times in the next 6 months when things got difficult and information and communications were not quite as optimal as we would have liked. And we were able to discuss compromises of which she was fully involved in. And it opened up and kept open conversations of how she would like to live and also how she would like to die. We feel it gave us extra months to make memories, to say our thank yous, to say goodbye, to find out on the photos who were all the people on the photos, to give them names. There were real celebrations and moments of joy and laughter. And she absolutely lived her life until she died. And we feel we did our best, which is all you can do. And that's definitely helped with our grief following Mum's death this year. Shortly after a diagnosis, I contacted the funeral director who had cared for my dad after he died. I asked for some advice on how to care for Mum if she did die at home. And she told me not to rush, to keep the room cool, open the windows, to make my mum comfortable and spend some time with her, to contact the doctor who would certify that she had died, and then to get back in contact with her. She remembered my mum and sent a love to her, and I passed this conversation on to Mum. It was good. It was a bit surreal, but it was good. And we were absolutely organised in life and in death now. And it felt absolutely right when Mum left the house she had lived in for 59 years into the care of the funeral director. But it was really hard at times. Our world shrank. Mum's world very soon became one room downstairs, her bed in the living room with the patio door open, looking out onto the garden. I slept by her side for months. I came home once in the next 6 months. It became harder for me to go on my walks. My mind wasn't ready for art. It was too full to read. My life worked around Mum. And I also needed to be a really strong advocate to find and work with systems to enable care for Mum. So all that self-care that I was doing so well following Ed's death, just the majority of it just went out of the window. Caring full time is really hard. But I was really fortunate that I could live with Mum. She had space in a home. I was retired, so I wasn't dependent on going out to work. There was a garden that I could be in. I had a really supportive family who worked as a team to support me and to support Mum. And I was also physically able to care for her. Mum's community was fantastic. They included and welcomed me. I was put on the neighbourhood WhatsApp group, and I felt if I needed anything, I could call on them. Chocolate comes to mind. I needed chocolate one day. They gave me chocolate. Walkers smiled and waved at us through the window as they passed. Fairy cakes were left to us, for us by neighbourhood children. The pharmacist delivery man always asked after Mum by name, and that was so important. It was the little things that kept us going. And it was the family and friends who gave support and saved my space for me for when I did come home. Mum's garden was a blessing. Growing seeds, thinking about whether they were actually worth planting, whether we had any time to see them grow. Doing it anyway, and so loving the colour and fruits they brought. It was living in the moment. Making any plans was so difficult, but I could invest in the here and now. I was so grateful to have this space. And Mum loved her garden. It brought her joy. And when she died, we gathered as a family the night before her funeral to make garlands and supposedly small posies from her garden to decorate her coffin. I think we're going on to the next slide.
We would be if I could do it, but I will. I'll get there. Keep going.
Let's keep talking. So we all gathered together as a family. It was grandchildren. It was my brother, his family. There was supposed to be small posies to actually put on the side of the coffin, and they just grew larger and larger. Tomatoes were added because they were there, and my brother especially really got into it. Here we are, Mum's garden. So it was just wonderful. It was a wonderful thing to do to come together. And the following morning, my daughter and I decorated Mum's coffin. I didn't know how we would feel because Mum was already in a coffin. But it was all really, really good. We chatted to her. We laughed at trying to fix the big poses. We attached our special messages on wooden hearts, and it was really, really relaxed. And it absolutely felt like Mum was surrounded by her garden again. And we had made more lovely memories that included Mum. Being included and having conversations, being allowed to contribute our skills, and knowing Mum's funeral wishes have all supported our collective grief. But we do realise how lucky we were to have had this opportunity to be involved, and so appreciate that many did not have that opportunity. So that was just my story. As I've said, just one of millions of other stories and conversations, but a story that has helped us. So back to community conversations and what we've been up to in Guiseley for the last year. We've only managed a couple of the face-to-face Good Grief Guiseley cafes this year, but these are restarting this Friday during the Kind of Leeds week at Guiseley Theatre. We have now planned those dates until next June, so fingers crossed. And the cafes are not counselling and they're not pressurised. It's just sitting down and chatting, if you want, over a cup of tea and cake in a space where we love talking about our loved ones, amongst many other conversations. It's just about being with others who totally understand. We also only managed a couple of walks but definitely hope to start these. This is just a view from one of these walks, and it's just looking at those big open spaces, big skies, being out in nature. It's lovely, I think, really beneficial. It's easier to talk as well when you're not looking at somebody sometimes, just being outside. So for National Grief Awareness Week last December, we asked our community over Twitter and Facebook if they would like to place a ribbon of their choosing on some trees in a small community garden opposite the theatre, cared for by Guiseley in Bloom. The ribbon would be to remember a loved one who had died, and we had over 70 ribbons of many different colours on the trees, and they stayed on from early December till after the new year, and all recognised individual loss and grief, and was a way of our community coming together despite the distances we had to keep. And the ribbons were carefully washed and retied in a big wicker heart, which will eventually become a piece of commemorative art in Guiseley Theatre. And I just saw yesterday where it's going to go, and it's going to look beautiful. We also lit up the theatre yellow on the final day of National Grief Awareness Week last year at 6 o'clock, and that followed a moment's silence. For National Grief Awareness Week this year, which is the 2nd to the 8th of December, we plan to light up the theatre orange this year. It's a nice warm colour. Lots of other buildings around the country are also going to be lit up orange. And on the final day, on the 8th of December at 6 o'clock, we will also have another minute silence, and we are hoping to gather together to have some refreshments, and because the Twitter hashtag this year is spread some warmth. It's just about checking in on your neighbour, walking and talking, going for a walk and talking, putting the kettle on, just being there. And these are this year's posters, which if you go on the Good Grief Trust website, you can just download. They've got a lot of resources on there. So these are going to be around. Other friends groups have enabled more connections during the last year. It's been fantastic. It's been really, really good to see so many different groups doing little things, which have allowed different people just to choose where to go from. So this is up at Parkinson's Park. This was over Christmas, where you could put a snowflake to remember a loved one's. There's also some little fairy gates there as well. And they're going to be doing that again this year. And I think it was wonderful. It's a perfect setting. There's also, do you want to put the next one up? Yes, this is the snake, the pebble snake. Or the python, which actually included, there was a couple of care homes which were included as well, so that everybody, young and old, could paint a pebble. It could be to remember a loved one. It could remember, it could be for anything, any emotion, any feeling. But it was just a matter. I thought it was really important that care homes were actually included, because they could have felt very isolated, and it was just a way of the community coming together. The Friends of the Cemetery, we'll go to the next one. I'll just keep talking and we'll catch up. The Friends of the Cemetery, it's also a really special community place. Even if you haven't, even if your loved ones are not buried in the cemetery, it is a place of heritage. And it's a place where you see an awful lot of people walking and just looking at the headstones. So it was very important to support websites up there and the notices, and we'd also planted plants of special meaning as well. These plants are so important. This is from Nunroyd. Park, who again, they've got a great arts and crochet group there, which is all bringing people together and just giving opportunities for people to come together and to connect. And then we've got benches, so many benches. When we couldn't see people inside, it became more important to go out for walks and more important to be able to be outside. And over the last year, there's been so many more benches, which has been fantastic. This is a natter bench, which is extra long. And there's Betty there, who absolutely loved a good natter. So it's just encouraging those conversations. There's been more benches in the cemeteries. We've got a couple more benches in the cemetery. And also we've got a really colourful community bench, which the art is actually based on people's stories that have been over the last years, looking at the kindness and the conversations and compassion that the community has shown. So those are just a few. There's been so many more opportunities for people to express and connect despite not being able to be together. And we're just a small part of so many conversations that are happening locally, nationally, and also worldwide. And for so long, we haven't talked about death, dying and grief, but we all die. It shouldn't come as a surprise to us. Again, Dr. Catherine Mannix talks about 2 days in our life, birth and death. Birth is generally planned for, it's talked about, options are given, and dying, we haven't felt comfortable talking about it, and we may miss things that could have helped and supported us. And there's been so much sadness over the last couple of years. I'm hoping this could be a real opportunity to move forward, to find out what works and what doesn't work for us, to improve our experience of death and dying, and that will hopefully support our feelings in loss and grief. So I'll also be forwarding surveys on Twitter and Facebook that ask about our experiences, totally accepting how hard this may be for so many people to fill them in and to answer. But unless we actually start telling our stories, change will happen really, really slowly. And I think it needs to change. So also, if there's any events that people can access, read, listen and watch, I'll be forwarding those as well, such as Good Grief Festival, which is at the end of this month. So many events there, many of them free and really supportive. There's also Death Positive Libraries, which have events talking with authors who have written books on death, about death, which have been good. And Full Circle Funerals have continued their online bereavement group, which is fantastic. It's really supportive. You've just got to jump in there. And it's also evolved into a WhatsApp group as well, which has been brilliant. So many great suggestions on that WhatsApp group. It's just finding ways to continue conversations and support each other in the community. Everybody needs kindness. Thank you very much. Have you got any questions?